Well, welcome everyone. My name is Cheryl Neckerman, President of the League of Women Voters of Schenectady County. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Together with the Union College Kenney Center for Community Engagement and Outreach, we are presenting a panel discussion on Proposition 1, New York's Equal Rights Amendment, known more commonly as the ERA. This program is being recorded by Union College and by the League and will be available on YouTube. And we'll try and have a link out there for you. Now, the ERA will be on the ballot this November. According to the Attorney General's recommended language, but which did not make it onto the ballot, the ERA protects against unequal treatment by New York and local governments, no matter your sex, age, disability status, ethnicity, or national origin, protects LGBT and pregnant people, protects abortion. A yes vote protects against unequal treatment for these reasons. A no vote leaves this protection out of the state constitution. Now, we've invited a number of people to participate on this panel and give their perspective on the ERA. Dr. Zoe Oxley is the chair of the Political Science Department at Union College. Reverend Martel Spagnolo is senior pastor at First Reformed Church in Schenectady. Helen Helmuth is senior advocate of Disability Rights New York. Nicole Marjasso is the director of organizing at Planned Parenthood. And Megan Chenchi is a leader of Planned Parenthood Generation Action and a student at Union College. Now, each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of the program to make sure each of our speakers has a chance to talk. So let's begin with our first speaker, Dr. Zoe Oxley. Now, she is the chair of the Political Science Department at Union College. She started as an assistant professor of political science in 1998 and became an associate professor in 2004. She was director of American Studies from 2014 to 2017, became a full professor in 2011, and is currently the chair of the Department of Political Science. Also, I've heard that Dr. Oxley is an awesome trivia team player. Zoe?
Should I stand?
It is totally up to you. You don't have to.
Actually.
Okay.
Should I use the mic? Yeah.
Yes, and just turn it on.
There, it's on, I think. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes. Maybe I have an awesome trivia team that I'm a member of. We'll go that far. Thanks, Cheryl, for this opportunity to talk to you all tonight about the Proposition 1. And
I don't think they can hear you.
so it's not. How about this? No? No? Can I just stand and hear my microphone? Yeah.
Sure. It's a very sensitive microphone.
Okay.
I'll take your chair away.
Sounds fine. Okay, how's that? Better? Great, thank you. So thank you, Cheryl, for the opportunity to talk to you all tonight about Proposition 1. And it's great to see you here. The proposition, of course, is important, as all possible constitutional amendments are on the ballot, and in my view is not getting enough attention from the media and from other circles, from the normal channels by which we learn about what is on our ballot each year. I also wanted to thank Ben DeAngelis of the Kenney Center for helping to organize this event, as well as a whole slate of voter education events happening on campus this fall. The proposal actually is not called the Equal Rights Amendment. Officially, it's called the New York Equal Protection of Law Amendment. And if you look at the language, and I think there's some language here on a slide. Okay, so I will actually read you the full line. This is a summary, but I will read you the full actual language, and you'll see why it's technically called the Equal Protection of Law Amendment. Currently, the New York State Constitution, Section 11, says the following: no person shall be denied the equal protection of the laws of this state or any subdivision thereof. No person shall, because of race, color, creed, or religion, be subjected to any discrimination in his or her civil rights by any other person or by any firm, corporation, or institution, or by the state or any agency or subdivision of the state. If amended, added to that language would be the following categories: ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, or sex, including sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, pregnancy, pregnancy outcomes, and reproductive health care and autonomy. So we're being asked as voters in New York if we would amend the Constitution to add those additional protected categories. And again, nowhere in that section does it say rights, equal rights. It simply says, I shouldn't say simply because it's a big deal. It states directly, explicitly, that the Constitution protects the individuals in those protected groups from discrimination. So again, if passed, the amendment would add a number of protected categories. So even though the amendment itself is the Equal Protection of Law Amendment, both sides, supporters and opponents, refer to it as the Equal Rights Amendment. It's not surprising, I don't think, particularly given the history in the US with the National Equal Rights Amendment, which, as we know, has never been added to the Constitution. But I do think it's important to note that the Constitution itself does not grant rights. It instead prohibits discrimination. Amending the New York State Constitution via a legislative proposal, which is the process that was used for this amendment, requires a number of steps. First, the proposed amendment needs to be passed by 2 successive New York State legislative sessions. So this current proposal was passed in July of 2022 with 78% support in the Senate, 68% in the Assembly. And then again in January 24th, 2023, with same support in the Assembly and a bit lower support in the Senate, but still 68 support in the Senate. The language here that Cheryl read from is the language that the New York State Attorney General suggested be included on the ballot as the abstract of the amendment. And that is what is included for us voters to read. What actually is included in the abstract is largely a restatement of the language itself in the amendment. It's much longer, it's much more complex language. The Board of Elections opted to use that more direct restatement of the constitutional amendment itself rather than language such as this, which again is a bit more direct. Also, it includes, as you'll see, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, my mistake. I thought this was the Attorney General language that Cheryl read earlier. Included reference to LGBT rights, protecting LGBT individuals, pregnant people, as well as protecting abortion. The Board of Elections opted not to use that language, which sort of brings up the question of whether this amendment would protect abortion rights or not. A lot of the attention it is receiving in the media and by proponents and opponents focuses on this matter of whether the amendment would protect abortion, with supporters arguing yes, and arguing that that's one of the main reasons to approve the amendment. As you know from the language here, the language I read out, abortion is not explicitly mentioned in the constitutional amendment itself. What the proposed amendment would do would stop a person from being discriminated against for any type of reproductive health care. According to a law professor at Cornell University, the amendment would protect the right to abortion in New York State by ensuring that prohibiting abortion would be an unconstitutional form of healthcare discrimination. And that's because, quoting him, it would single out one form of reproductive health care and not other kinds of health care, unquote. Supporters including Democrats, see not only this amendment as important to be passed for the protections it would provide, anti-discrimination protections for all of the groups mentioned, but also see it as an opportunity to increase turnout across the state among groups who are inclined to support the amendment, and therefore perhaps boost vote share for Democrats on the ballot. This is akin to many of the pro-abortion propositions and constitutional amendments that are on ballots across the US this fall. I believe it's 10 states where there are abortion items on the ballot. Opponents of Proposition 1 are also tying it to abortion, among other topics, arguing that if passed, abortions would be allowed to be permitted through the 9th month of a pregnancy, arguing that the Constitution Amendment itself doesn't permit to discriminate on the basis of reproductive health care, and therefore it would be impossible to put any limits on abortion within the state of New York. The amendment faced a legal challenge, really around a technicality. You might have heard about this in the news. A Republican state legislator filed a challenge to the amendment, arguing that there was a procedural error when state lawmakers passed it. They passed it for the second time without receiving a required legal memo from the Attorney General. One of the procedural steps in the passing of a constitutional amendment in New York State is for the Attorney General to issue such a memo. She did issue it, but after the legislature had already passed the proposal. So that procedural error led to a state legislature to challenge the proposal. And one judge agreed with the challenge that, in fact, the procedural error meant that the proposition could not appear on the ballot this fall. But then that decision was overturned by our higher level court, and the overturning was then affirmed by the state court, the top state court in the state. I do think it's important to recognize, though, that neither one of the appeals courts decided on the merits of whether the procedural error mattered or not. The highest court in the state let the prior appeal stand. The prior overturning stand on the grounds that no substantial constitutional question was directly involved. The end result, though, is that the proposed amendment is, as we all know, and that's why we're here on the ballot this fall. Now I just want to take a few minutes to review kind of who's supporting, what groups are supporting, what groups are opposing, and then just a little overview of some other arguments that have been put forth in support and in opposition of Proposal 1. On the supporting side, as sort of I've already mentioned, a number of Democratic politicians in the state, including all the high-level Democrats in the state, have come out in favor of Proposal 1. A variety of civil rights and civil liberties organizations support it. Variety of reproductive rights organizations in the state support it. And there's a newly formed group that is set up to campaign for this proposal called New Yorkers for Equal Rights. A variety of arguments that have been put forth to support the proposition. These generally fall into sort of the large category of protecting against discrimination for the groups whose currently are not mentioned in the Constitution. And then there's, of course, a number of sub-arguments depending upon the group and mentioning the importance of making sure that individuals in those categories do not suffer discrimination in the state of New York. And then there is various arguments involving around the issue of abortion, and particularly codifying New York state law, which does protect abortion rights in the state, but a higher level of protection, of course, is at the constitutional level. Just again, a little brief overview of some supporting and opposing arguments, and many others I'm sure will come out this evening. On the opposing side are some Republican politicians, including the state Republican Party, the New York Catholic Conference, a variety of pro-life organizations, and the sort of largest campaign group that was formed to oppose Prop 1 is called Protect Kids New York. Some of the opposition arguments that we've heard, I'm going to read you one from the state part of the statement from the state Republican Party, the New York State Republican Party. Quote, "The broad and ambiguous language of the ERA would create new constitutional rights and likely become the subject of litigation by activist groups seeking to create new rights inconsistent with the views of most New Yorkers, end quote. The statement goes on to say specifically that if passed, the Constitution would give minors access to gender-affirming care without parental consent, and also would allow transgender students to compete in school athletics using their chosen gender identity rather than their sex assigned at birth. And primarily that is framed in terms of girls' sports being threatened. Another Republican Assembly member, David DiPietro, had this to say, quote, "The passage of the Equality Amendment would result in the further erosion of religious liberty for New Yorkers whose faith and traditions teach that abortion, homosexuality, and/or transgenderism are immoral and could subject many faith-based charities and schools to catastrophic liability," end quote. Finally, the Protect Kids New York website has a number of very brief points about why this proposal should be voted down. And the four that are very prominent on their website include: a no vote will, number one, save women's rights; number two, defend parental rights; number three, defend religious liberties; and number four, protect senior discounts, with the latter obviously pointing at that age discrimination could potentially mean that groups now that, like seniors that receive discounts, economic discounts in retail outlets, would be prohibited from receiving those because you would no longer be able to discriminate on the basis of age. So that would be sort of fleshing out what that argument is. Okay, I think I will turn it over now to our next speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Zoe. And I think we are going to try the microphone again, or maybe even the second microphone. But first, so our next speaker is Reverend Dr. Martel Spagnuolo from the First Reformed Church. He's a senior pastor. He has a doctorate of ministry. He's been a pastor in churches in New Jersey, New Hampshire, and South Dakota before coming to Schenectady in 2017. Martel has also participated in a number of programs, including Shoulder to Shoulder, Cohorts for Courage, Voices for Peace, Chaplaincy Education for New Jersey State Troopers, Critical Team Management Training, and Boundary Awareness Programs. Go ahead, Martel.
It is an honor and a pleasure being here. Can you hear me back there? Oh, excellent. I was shocked when I was asked to do this, to be honest, because I looked at the panel and they were all better equipped at this than I. And I felt like, and I am, the old white guy in the room. I get that. I read the Equal Protection of Laws, Discrimination of Civil Rights Prohibited, and then I read some of the arguments. And it came to me that many of the things that we don't see are the personal stories. We don't see the personal stories. So I want to share with you, first of all, some personal stories. And then I want to discuss with you some of the arguments against this and where they are extremely problematic. I am an openly gay man who has lived through the AIDS crisis and has been bashed, has been discriminated against, and has been treated with lesser value than my people with my same degree in my same place. I have served churches in areas where I was quote unquote considered white passing because my last name is Spagnuolo. I have friends and family that identify as non-cis normative or transgender. And I have watched how they have been abused and maligned and discriminated against. We are talking about real people with real issues trying to live their life. And to put it in the words of my grandmother, who was the second female Catholic anesthesiologist in the United States, you have to keep fighting for rights or you won't get them. Let me make that very clear. Angela Rafael Veronica Dobrosa Martel the second female Catholic anesthesiologist in the United States, said if you don't fight for rights, you won't get them. And we know that unless things are specifically put down in black and white, they don't count. When I was in South Dakota, I worked with a woman named Susan Williams. And Susan had a child who was, as a little child, told their parents that they were a boy. Now, the parents were under the assumption that this child was not. And this child at one point said to their parents, "Would you rather have a dead daughter or a live and vibrant son?" Susan brought that to her church because she was a good Christian woman, and her church ostracized her and her family for seeking guidance. Susan started an organization called the Transformation Project. It is now national. She started it in a small room in the First Congregational Church in Sioux Falls when I was senior pastor. And Wyatt, who I taught how to tie a bow tie, is now a college sophomore, fighting for Wyatt's rights. Wyatt is a happy, handsome young man, despite what may or may not be on his birth certificate at this time. Who are we, or who is anyone, to discriminate against Wyatt? See my point? So, when I read these arguments, I must admit I get a little angry. Those of us who take our faith and our religion very seriously are very concerned about lawsuits against the church or against a certain faith or religion. I, as a Trinitarian theologian who loves Jesus Christ and has dedicated my life to the service of the church, gets angry when someone is worried about a monetary value of the church and uses the church's limited teaching as a weapon. I have a problem with that because my faith opens doors to widows and orphans and aliens. My faith sees that God created them, male and female. He created them with blurred lines and no specific boys have to wear blue and girls have to wear pink. I get angry when I have to read people that write stuff like this, take a law of love, a law of beautiful creation, and limit it and expect other people to live within their paradigms. This law is really about freedom. Freedom for people like me to choose how we are to live our life. For people like me who want to live and love freely without discrimination. For people like Wyatt, who want to live freely and without discrimination. For people like my grandmother, who had to fight for her rights to serve as a doctor because she was a female. Freedom for my sister, who has to struggle every day in a man's world to doubly prove herself, although she's brighter than all of them. And when I say all of them, I mean all of them. So that's why it's really important for me to be here tonight, to let you know the real stories and the real problems, and to point at some of these arguments as being bogus, short-sighted, and limited. Yes, I don't know the law, but I do know my theology and I do know philosophy. And these arguments are short-sighted and limited. I'm finished.
Okay, well, thank you, Martel. Okay, our next speaker is Helen Helmuth from Disability Rights New York. She's a senior advocate and has been advocating for the accessibility of voting and elections in New York State since 2016. Helen was involved in Hernandez versus New York State Board of Elections, which ultimately established an accessible absentee ballot procedure in New York State. In 2023, Helen and her team co-published a comprehensive report with the Brennan Center for Justice on the accessibility of early voting in New York State. Helen remains committed to advocating for inclusive election access for all New Yorkers, with a particular interest in educating voters with disabilities about their right to vote.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me all right? So, as was mentioned, my name is Helen Helmuth. I'm a senior advocate at Disability Rights New York. And for those of you who don't know, Disability Rights New York is the protection and advocacy agency for New York State. And what that means is our office is designated by the governor to provide free legal and advocacy services to people with disabilities. Every state in the country has a protection and advocacy office just like ours. Now, as is included in the Equal Rights Act, it codifies the protections of people with disabilities. And over a quarter of New York adults have disabilities. That's over almost 4 million adults living with a disability. When people hear disability and they hear law, the first thing they probably think of is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed almost 35 years ago. And you would think that everything would be accessible since it was passed over 35 years ago, but if you look around, you'll notice that it's not. And in my work, going to polling places throughout the state and surveying them for accessibility, I see firsthand that polling sites, which is a protected right under the federal constitution, is not always open equally to people with disabilities. And there's also Section 504 of the Rehab Act, which covers the protections for people in any program receiving federal financial assistance. We have the New York State Human Rights Law, which protects the rights of people with disabilities. If you live in New York City, there's the New York City Rights Law, which protects people with disabilities. And so you might be thinking, why is disability protections important to be included in the ERA? And the reason for that is, as was mentioned at the top by Zoe, this had to go through 2 legislative sessions. It had to pass the Senate and the Assembly, and then the Senate and the Assembly again, had to be signed by the governor, and now it has to be voted on. It is a lot more difficult to change the state constitution and take rights away that way than federal laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. Laws can be weakened, as we see around the country with things like Dobbs, which I'm sure will be touched on at some point, but laws can be weakened, and it is not fair to people with disabilities or any of the people included in the Equal Rights Act to have their rights be able to be taken away at whim, depending on who is in office. And there are also conflicting laws. So there may be laws that conflict, like zoning in municipalities, where a person with a disability may need to have a ramp built on their home, but it's not within the zoning laws. Something like the Equal Rights Act would protect their right as a person with a disability to live independently and freely in the community and to make the adaptations they need to in order to live independently in the community. Now, having a state constitution supports state and federal laws. So again, you heard me talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that is still a very important law, and the state constitution would bolster all the federal laws and protections that are already in place. A state constitution would bolster state laws that are already in place. And that's really the long and short of it. Before this panel, I'm very honored to be invited, and I'm so happy to be up here speaking on behalf of the disability component. It is that simple. the laws that are in place right now are not strong enough, or they can always be stronger. And codifying it in the state constitution is one way to do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Helen. All right, our next speaker is Nicole Marjasso from Planned Parenthood. She serves as the Director of Organizing for Planned Parenthood of Greater New York Action Fund. She has been in the movement for sexual and reproductive freedom with Planned Parenthood for 7 years. Nicole is passionate about being in service to community and being part of a movement that fights for the rights of all people to lead lives with dignified bodily autonomy. Most importantly, she is the mom of 2 boys, a dog, and 9 chickens. Nicole.
Is it okay if I stand?
Sure.
Okay.
Do you want to stand up here?
No, I'm happy to stand over here. Then I can see the slides if you don't mind. Can you all hear me okay? Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's great to be here with you all. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for having Planned Parenthood of Greater New York Action Fund here. Thank you to Union College. Thank you to the Reverend for bringing your whole self here and for sharing all those stories. This has been in the works for several years now, and I've been here since the beginning fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment. And so we're so close to the end. And as Dr. Oxley was saying, a lot of people still don't know about it, which is scary. But I'm so hopeful. And I'm even more hopeful being here with you all tonight. So we can go to slides. Okay, great. So this image was taken just a few weeks after the overturn of Roe with the Dobbs decision. On the very left here of this 100-foot long banner is me and my kids pulling that banner. And this is the Brooklyn Bridge, where my organization, along with advocacy partners, pulled together about 35,000 people to get out into the streets to channel all of our energy and indignation for what had just happened. And so from a reproductive rights framework, what has already been said in some ways, and what I want to share is that Proposition 1, the Equal Rights Amendment, is New York's response to the overturn of Roe. This is what we're doing in response. When Roe was taken away, abortion rights were kicked back to the states, and we have painfully seen anti-abortion care legislation, restriction bans sweeping across the country in anti-states. And we have also seen states take action. There have been 6 states that have had constitutional amendment proposals regarding abortion. 4 were successful in adding abortion rights to their state constitution, similarly to how we are. And 2 were successful in defeating constitutional amendments restricting abortion. So we know, as everyone knows, that abortion is a winning issue because the majority of Americans trust people to make the best decisions for themselves and their families and their futures. So now it's our turn. Here we are, New York. But it's not just about abortion rights. We can go to the next slide. It's about all the people listed here that we've been talking about. All these groups of people are not currently included in the equal rights in our current state constitution, which is outdated. So we have an opportunity here to not only enshrine reproductive rights protections in our state constitution, but for all of these groups of people who should all also have protections within our state constitution. We have seen in our country sweeping legislation that is anti-trans in nature, that has taken a tremendous toll on trans youth and families of trans youth. It has been horrific to watch. And so this amendment is an opportunity for New Yorkers to say that we support our trans youth and their families. Pregnancy status. This amendment would provide protections against discrimination for people who may choose abortion care. for people who may be suffering from a miscarriage or stillbirth, or for people who decide to continue with their pregnancy. We need our Constitution to be updated with rights for all of these people. It's time. You can go to the next slide. So getting a little bit more granular, here's some examples of how Proposition would provide protections from potential future electeds or governors who may be anti-sexual and reproductive health care. They would not be able to pass a state abortion ban. They would not be able to halt funding for abortion via state Medicaid. They would not be able to ban private insurance companies from covering abortion care. They would not be able to prosecute or criminalize pregnancy outcomes. This craziness is happening in other states. What are we going to do for our future New Yorkers? Governor Hochul did not win by a lot in her last election. They would not be able to add medically unnecessary burdens on patients or facilities, which happens. So the reality is that the majority of New Yorkers absolutely support protections for all those groups of people listed. The majority of New Yorkers are pro-abortion and believe, again, and trust that people can make the best decisions for themselves, their bodies, their families, their futures. Unfortunately, as Dr. Oxley mentioned, there is what we call an anti-campaign. You can go to the next slide. And so, and we often see anti-campaigns, right? There was a big anti-campaign before the Reproductive Health Act was passed in 2019, where they were spreading disinformation and doing fear-mongering, and that's what they do, right? And we passed and we won. So we're seeing an anti-campaign here now. This campaign is called Coalition to Protect Kids New York. And the angle that they're taking is they can't come after abortion because they know that abortion is a winning issue. It's being proven all across the country. It's a winning issue. So the angle they are taking is attacking transgender rights. And they are doing this with a campaign of disinformation and straight up lies. Straight up lies. One of the examples that Dr. Oxley gave was they are telling parents that schools could take their children and go ahead and pursue gender affirming surgery. This is a lie. You absolutely have to have parents' consent. All minors have to have parents' consent for gender affirming surgery in New York, period. It's just a complete lie. They are saying that trans kids are the threat to cis girls' sports and posing themselves as women's rights, fighting for equality. This is a complete lie. We know that women's rights includes trans rights and every other rights of people that are listed here. We know the biggest threats to cis girls and all girls sports is actually racism, sexism, unequal distribution of financial resources for their sports, not other trans kids who are trying to have a normal life. They are misnaming the Equal Rights Amendment as the Parent Replacement Act. So it's just complete fear-mongering, right? Unfortunately, it's effective. The polls show us, research shows us that even New Yorkers who absolutely believe in and want the Equal Rights Amendment, when they receive this messaging, they are less likely to vote for it. We also know New York doesn't have a great track record for ballot measures to begin with. So even though it seems that in what is considered to be a progressive state we live in, of course we should have all these rights in our state constitution, we are absolutely in the middle of a battleground. And we need everyone to join in. You all coming here tonight and being informed is part of that. And we need more. We need people to actually join the campaign, to talk to everyone you know, to get out into neighborhoods with us, to knock on doors, to have one-on-one conversations. I've been here in Schenectady. The first door I went to was where I heard that story. A gentleman said to me, "Do you have kids?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you know if this passes, the schools can take your kids and go have them get surgery?" I couldn't believe. And this was a smart gentleman, and he wanted to keep talking about this. This wasn't someone who just was like, oh, I heard, he was really informed, but had heard this anti-campaign messaging. Anyways, I'm derailing. We need everyone to join us. You can go to the next slide. We are part of the New Yorkers for Equal Rights Coalition. We are one of the members of the coalition. And our campaign, the way that we're carrying out this work is, as I mentioned, doing door-to-door canvassing, crowd canvassing, phone banking, house parties, inviting us to speak at your congregation or other organizational spaces. However you want to do it, there's multiple ways to get involved. You click on this QR code with your camera. It will take you to all of our upcoming actions that you can sign up for. And Megan's going to tell us a little bit about their lovely table outside, but there's in a plexiglass frame, there's a flyer for an upcoming Schenectady Day of Action. We'll go to the next slide. An upcoming Schenectady Day of Action on September 28th, where we're going to be out canvassing. So we'd love to have you join us. And canvassing is incredibly important. Just quickly, we know it is the most impactful political organizing tool to actually affect people voting for a campaign or a candidate. That face-to-face contact, actually speaking to people, is what makes the biggest difference. One thing I just want to say quickly, and but I was so disturbed about hearing some of what was shared in terms of religious organizations being scared about being sued and lawsuits. And just recently, I was doing a lot of digging into right here in Schenectady, horrific allegations, confirmed allegations of abuse happening within the churches here. So if anybody needs a talking point in terms of these lawsuits that they're anticipating, there are lawsuits of a very different nature that they should be focusing on and finding the root causes of and remedy, as opposed to being worried about this. Anyways, derail. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So please go home, talk to your families, your friends, your neighbors, the community spaces that you're in. Talk to everyone about the Equal Rights Amendment Proposition 1 before Election Day. Find some way to get involved. You can follow us on social media, on Instagram and Facebook. You can also go to NewYorkersForEqualRights.org and find other ways to get involved, and also follow them on social media. However you feel inspired and called to, but please do act if this is something that you believe in and you want to see pass. And then just a few dates to remember here. Our Schenectady Day of Action will be September 28th, October 26th. Final day to request an absentee ballot and to register to vote, and early voting begins. And of course, the big Tuesday, November 5th. And with that, I'm going to pass it over.
Okay, well, thank you, Nicole. Okay, our next speaker is Megan Chenchi from Planned Parenthood Generation Action. Megan Chenchi is a student at Union College, class of 2026, and is a leader of Planned Parenthood Generation Action, or PP Gen Action. She is a biology major, minoring in philosophy. In her spare time, she enjoys doing volunteer work, reading books, doing yoga, and meditating. Megan's goal in life is to help serve others. She hopes to practice traditional forms of medicine and to work more specifically with women and children's health, wellness, and advocacy.
Thank you. Oh yeah, and I have a slide if you could put that up. Thank you. I'm excited to be here with you all tonight and to share a student's perspective on the topics in a more personal and informal way. So speaking to you as a 20-year-old college student, it's often hard to see how politics and legislation can have such a profound impact on our lives. What makes Prop 1 so relevant, not just in a broader sense, but personally as well, is how big of an impact it leaves on our generation. 18 to 26-year-olds utilize reproductive resources and services more than any other population. We more regularly engage in hookups and sexual encounters. We're at that time in our lives, and that's great. This means, though, that we have to be more attentive of being on some form of birth control, thinking about Plan B and abortion services. We're also paving the way for future generations in terms of accepting ourselves and our bodies. This means within our demographic, we identify strongly with minority groups and rights such as the LGBTQ+ community. All over the US, these rights have been under attack. It's our responsibility to advocate for ourselves and for those to come. We want birth control, we want safe sex, and Plan B. Consenting to sex is not consenting to having a baby, and that is a concept that has been lost amongst political leaders today. We deserve to be protected in our decisions and in who we are. This means no discrimination, no harsh laws on our bodies, and protections for all. This is our world too, not just the world of conservative older white men. Proposition 1 gives us the chance to solidify these protections within New York, to prevent the implementation of future laws that would fail to protect pregnancy outcomes, autonomy, and reproductive rights, as well as to protect against age-based, gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability discrimination. We know on a deeper level that bans and restrictions on reproductive and sexual health care disproportionately affect already marginalized communities. These communities already face systemic barriers when it comes to accessing healthcare services. For this reason, individuals in lower income communities are associated with higher rates of teen pregnancy and increased barriers when accessing abortion, counseling services, and other supportive resources. This means children in poverty have children in poverty. Let's make the future generation better than ours. Children and teenagers deserve the right to say no to pregnancy, to have affordable access to contraceptives, Plan B, and abortion. And their children deserve to be raised in communities free of discrimination, with the ability to express themselves in all means of their identification. Plan B, on average, costs between $40 to $50, already preventing marginalized communities and many college students like me from having access to this service. Now, politicians are trying to take it a step further and take it off the market completely. Some states are making it illegal to receive an abortion, meaning you can face time in prison for refusing to carry the child of your abuser. Right now, we have the opportunity here in New York to put in place protections this November that many other states don't have. We can keep New York State with reproductive rights, a state free of discrimination. We cannot let politicians take our rights away. We control our bodies and our identities. College students want Plan B. We don't want children, but we do want sex. So I urge you all to vote. Vote for your rights, for the rights of your younger sister and your transgender friend. Vote like your life depends on it, because for many, it does. And aside from voting, I am on the leaderboard of our wonderful chapter of Planned Parenthood Generation Action here on campus. We have a table outside where we have more information that you can get after this panel. And throughout the year, we host tabling events to promote safe sex, voter registration, and the distribution of contraceptive resources. Our meetings consist of informational awareness on events occurring in the world and on campus. We discuss available resources to students and talk about reproductive rights and education. We have access to free Plan B, condoms, dental dams, and more for all of our students. And getting involved with our chapter of PPGen is very easy. So we are open to everyone and provide support and resources in a safe and inclusive capacity. And thank you all for listening to me tonight.
Okay, thank you, Megan. And now we'd like to open the floor to questions. Yes.
This may be for Professor Oxley. If there happens to become a national ban, a statutory ban on abortion, how would that affect this constitutional amendment if it passes?
Okay, and I'm just going to repeat that in case anybody didn't hear the question. The question was, if there were to come a national ban on abortion, how would that affect the result of passing the ERA?
So according to the, it is on this time. According to the federal constitution, any federal law supersedes any state law, including state constitutions. So if a federal law passes to prohibit abortion across the country, then that effectively overturns any law in the state allowing abortion, as well as any constitutional guarantee within a state constitution to guarantee abortion. So federal law always overrules. If there's a conflict between the two, federal law wins that conflict.
Thank you.
Okay, another question? Yes.
What was the reason for adding as many groups as were added? Was that to make passage easier, or do you see more difficulty? I can see where each of the groups has a vested interest in passage, but both the language and the number of groups would seem to complicate passage. What is the response?
Okay, so let me just quickly rephrase that. Why do the speakers think that so many groups were added to this proposition instead of having something more focused?
Right. Now, I can't speak to why the ERA includes every group, but the slogan for disability advocacy is nothing about us without us. And getting ahead of the discrimination, because if you're not included in the protections from the jump, it's a lot harder to have those protections added. So a lot of my work at DRNY is making sure that accessibility is included in language all across the board. And so for the ERA, if something like this was on the table and disability wasn't an added protection, you would see a rally of disability rights advocates saying, don't forget us, we want to be included in this. And so I imagine that's similar to why all the other groups are included as well, but.
I also think we have seen in the past that when things are not parsed out so clearly, they have been limited by practice. For instance, when all men are created equal in a philosophical sense, that is for all humanity. And yet it became something that was gender specific. And so we, by our history, have learned that if they are not included, we, as a culture, tend to limit the language.
I have less insight into what happened in the halls of the state legislature than probably Helen and Nicole do. So I will say what I think probably happened or was probably precipitating cause or two. And they could flesh out if other things, if I'm incorrect, or if what happened on the ground differed. Oftentimes legislators have great ideas or what they consider to be great ideas for bills or constitutional amendments. And they wait for a window of opportunity to get that passed. My understanding of what happened to get Prop 1 on the ballot now is that window of opportunity was Dobbs. So Dobbs comes around and New York State wants to respond, I think is what Nicole had said. And so it was a door opened, a window opened, and it was a way for this constitutional amendment, which had been kicking around for various groups for a while. Let me just tell you again, the New York State Constitution only prevents discrimination currently based on race, color, creed, or religion. That's it, race, color, creed, or religion. So that is very narrowing. So groups who wanted to advocate for expanding non-discrimination protection for other groups beyond those listed in the Constitution had proposals around. And I don't know the legislative history, if some were voted down before or what have you, but my guess is that with Dobbs, there was recognition that the New York State Constitution needed stronger protections for abortion and reproductive rights. And by the way, there are lots of other groups who aren't well protected in the Constitution as well. So that's my guess about what had happened and why now as opposed to before. But again, those who are more involved in lobbying the state or aware of groups' activity at the states wouldn't know for sure if that's really what happened.
Can you hear me? I think the only thing I would add to all that is, for me, the Equal Rights Amendment is a really beautiful piece of intersectional legislation. We have made mistakes in the past when we have tried to fight against oppression, against discrimination from these siloed spaces, right? We're all different groups fighting the same fight, when what we realize is oppression is oppression. And when you're thinking about who faces most oppression, it's those who are most marginalized in our communities. And these are the groups who are most marginalized in our communities. So if we are all fighting together to say that we all deserve protection against discrimination, for me, I think that's how we should be fighting all these battles.
There's a question in the back there.
So in attempting to get this proposition passed, you see the challenge lying more in quelling misinformation that opponents are spreading, or in increasing the general level of voter turnout for the election? And I guess based on that answer, what's the best way for general citizens to move forward if they want to show their support for it?
I would say it's probably both. My work centers more on I'm more in tune with voter turnout. But yeah, I would say a lot of people don't even know that there's propositions on the back of the ballot until they get there on election day. And most of them don't even flip the ballot over. And so I would say probably general awareness is a big piece.
One of the big lessons, at least the lessons that I learned by studying the failure of the National Equal Rights Amendment on the Constitution. Of course, it was proposed in 1972, and then a few years, but not enough states at the time ratified. It died in part because different constituencies objected to a piece here or there, or individuals who oppose believed this argument, and then a few other people believed another argument, good people believed another argument. So that whether the arguments that were put forth, some of them were inaccurate, others though were full of misinformation. So one of the main opponents of the ERA called it the Extra Responsibilities Amendment, arguing that women would be forced to work outside the home whether they wanted to or not. Clearly, that's not at all what the amendment said. So I think the countering misinformation we learned from that episode, but also from many things that we've encountered over many more recent election cycles, is incredibly important. And linking to the last question that was asked, the variety of groups that are on the amendment is going to appeal to many people who want to banish discrimination from our society, who are worried about oppression. So it is going, the breadth of the amendment is going to speak very strongly to a large number of people in New York, but others might just be opposed to, well, this one group, I'm a little worried about this one group. So that gives more room for the amendment to die, again, from a variety of different constituents opposing one small aspect of it. But again, I think countering misinformation is crucial, but also reframing the debate. If you encounter anyone, if you're presenting or talking to your friends or on social media, reframing the discussion to focus on the necessity to make sure we're preventing discrimination and oppression and upholding rights for individuals, wide range of individuals across the state, can help to combat the misinformation.
And I would just throw in a comment that do whatever appeals to you the most. What do you feel the most passion for? Is it getting out the vote, or is it trying to correct misinformation? People see the passion. Yes.
I'd like to add a comment to Laura's question. One of the reasons the Equal Rights Amendment was voted down in New York State and others was a concerted effort by Operation Wake Up, which was an umbrella organization started by Phyllis Schlafly in St. Louis. And they were very, very effective and they had pulled together groups from different constituencies to fight against it. And I'm really glad to see the tables turn. Now you're starting coalitions to fight against the misinformation. And there are some, I was a producer of WMHT's 4-part series on the Equal Rights Amendment and the NPR's National Public and PBS. We were both. PBS special on the Equal Rights Amendment, and had gone into this in quite a bit of detail and worked with both sides. And I'm really just very glad that right now we're not talking about bathrooms, but bathrooms are a part of this now. So I think in a way being under the radar is not a bad way to go to get this passed. Just a comment.
Any other comments? Go ahead.
I just, well, I do a lot of voter registration and I am amazed and maybe actually a little hopeful that I think I might have talked to one person this year doing voter registration who knew what the Equal Rights Amendment was in the New York State Constitution. And I've always found that kind of depressing, but now I'm thinking, no, these other people aren't getting to them yet. And I'm arming them first. So maybe that is the way to go, to get out there and have that conversation. Anyhow, I've been heartened by the enthusiasm that comes from the people I talk to once there's, I give them a flyer and I tell them what this would mean for them. The other thing is that if, the amendment just said all New Yorkers deserve, equal rights or discrimination, then they would be parsing out other people. And so it's important to have everybody in your state constitution. I'm assuming, Dr. Oxley, if there is a federal abortion ban that trumps the abortion right in our state constitution, saying we get this amendment passed, but if everything else stays in place, would that be correct?
All other aspects, yes, all other acts. It would not invalidate the entire amendment.
So it's still worthwhile.
Yes.
It's still worthwhile then.
All right, I have a question. They don't call me Dr. Doom for nothing. What is the worst thing that you could foresee coming if this amendment was passed? And if you don't think of anything, I will. All right, maybe not the worst thing. How about just a bad thing? All right, let me throw one thing out there. Is that you never know how a judge will interpret a constitutional amendment or any law for that matter. So, because we've seen this happen in other states with laws that people interpreted them, that judges interpreted them in a way that politicians had not foreseen. Yes.
Do you have less leeway to, as a judge, to interpret the Constitution, or to, you have more leeway to reinterpret the law? Or, than you do the state, the state or federal constitution? I'm just thinking that, I know a famous argument by Justice Scalia, which is why Roe was wrongly decided, that women aren't in the Constitution.
So judges are often interpreting laws and not the Constitution. It would be the top court in the state that is primarily responsible for interpreting the Constitution of the state. That doesn't mean that other judges don't or don't attempt to. But the purview of state constitution interpretation is more at the level of the highest court in the state. And then sometimes the Supreme Court gets called in, the US Supreme Court gets called in as well, if the losing side at the state level wanted to appeal it up. But often it's more of a case of lower level judges looking at a law, or more likely, they're looking at the facts of a case to see if a law has been broken. Or if the Constitution has been violated, the constitutional question comes into play. Most court cases at lower levels aren't about the constitutional questions. They're more about just facts of the case and whether any particular state law was violated. I'm at a.
No, I'm So I'm
So you
thinking
thought of
about
something.
our history and of the world and how it works, right? 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And there are always going to be limited minds and limited people that are going to push a limited agenda and to hearken backwards, right? We have, but that would mean that the next generation will have to hone the law more clearly to move forward. And make no mistake, we are so much more forward than we were 250 years ago. We continue to move forward. So the worst that's going to happen is that we will take a step back and then force the hand of the modern mind and the modern person to take 2 steps forward.
Good answer.
I actually, if it's all right, I have a question. So going back to the federal, if there's a federal abortion ban, that would trump a state codifying abortion rights. In my work, so if a city law has more protections than a state law, the city law prevails. So the New York City human rights law, if you need a reasonable accommodation, your landlord has to pay for that accommodation. Whereas the state human rights law, you just have to be allowed to make an accommodation to your home, but if you rent, but you need to pay for that accommodation. So what we're saying is if there is a federal, it's not the same for state versus federal. Interesting.
Yes, in part because the examples of a state abortion ban would be directly in contradiction to a state law that permits abortion.
Yeah.
Whereas the example you give is more about within the same domain, what has to be provided to an individual with a disability, as opposed to saying this can't be provided and this could be provided, you know? Yeah, so that would be at least one distinction. And it's definitely the case that in many localities around the country, human rights protections are broader at the locality level than they are in some cases at the state level.
Thank you. Learned something new up here.
Yes.
To be clear about that, the reason why some localities have laws that are more protective in virtually all cases are because the state allows them to do that. There have been instances around the country where localities have enacted various things, protect one thing or another. And then the state legislature, this has happened in Texas, because you're sure it happened in Texas, because it is Texas, then passed laws that said that the locality could not enact whatever it was. I think these might have been gender discrimination matters. I'm not quite sure what the subject was, but I know that's what happened in Texas. So the pattern that you described here in New York is something that we can be reasonably happy we have in New York, but it's not a guaranteed universal rule.
Thank you for that.
So I've been thinking about Martel's comment. 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And sometimes I think people get complacent if things are going really well, and so they stop fighting. And then a right is overturned, and all of a sudden people are like, "Whoa, wait a minute, I do want that right. So I think that we do get the 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Which step are we at now?
Charge.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, that brings an end to our program tonight. I'd like to thank Union College for hosting this event. They've been wonderful. Don't forget to vote on Proposition 1, New York's Equal Rights Amendment. It will be on the back of your ballot. Don't forget to flip it over. Election Day is November 5th. Early voting starts on October 26th until November 3rd. You also have the option of voting early by mail. Keep in mind that the request for voting early by mail must be received by the Board of Elections by October 26th, and the completed ballots must be postmarked no later than November 5th. And I do believe to join us outside for refreshments. Thank you.